Chapter 6. To examine and report on the actions and activities of the state, such as the Guyana Police Force, the Guyana Defence Force, the Guyana National Service, the Guyana People's Militia, and those who were in command and superintendence of these agencies, to determine whether they were tasked with the surveillance of and carrying out of actions, and whether they did execute those tasks and carried out those actions against the political opposition of the period 1st January 1978 to 31st December 1980. The totality of the evidence presented to us clearly and obviously painted a grim picture as to how the country of Guyana was run, according to our TOR limit, the period from January 1st, 1978 to December 31st, 1980. We have no hesitation in concluding that the political directorate at the time, under the leadership of the late Mr. L.F.S. Burnham, Prime Minister and the late President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, and as head of state, was the supreme authority and commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the Republic. He was not only the head of the Guyana Defence Force Board, but was also head of the National Security Committee, and from all the evidence kept a very tight rein on all aspects of the country's business. The tight rein we have mentioned has its deep root and genesis in the concept of party paramountcy, a concept proclaimed by the then Prime Minister, Mr. Burnham. David Granger, now President Brigadier retired, recorded in his book, National Defense, A Brief History of the Guyana Defense Force 1965 to 2005, at pages 186 to 187, that paramountcy, the increasing involvement of the defense force in party politics, a marked departure from the apparent non-partisan stance taken in the immediate post-independence period, raised public concern about the direction being taken by civil-military relations. This pattern of politicization became more evident after the promulgation of the Declaration of Sofia on 14th December 1974, exactly 10 years after the PNC had first come to power. As a consequence of this thinking, political participation was positively promoted and many officers and soldiers were encouraged to become members of the PNC in the ensuing period. Similar ideas had been embraced by the GDF High Command for several years, and in 1977, the Chief of Staff, Clarence Prince, appeared in military uniform before the PNC's second biennial Congress and pledged publicly, or loyalty and dedication to the comrade leader of the People's National Congress and Prime Minister Forbes Burnham, committing the defense force to, following the road mapped out by the party and government. This ritual pledge of loyalty was repeated in succeeding Congresses up to Burnham's death in 1985. As a result of these measures, the civil administration was able to establish and maintain its control over the GDF. It was not felt that there was need to install civilian political agents in military units, as it was thought that there was already significant support for the PNC party in the force. This interest was fostered by the attitude of the Prime Minister, who, as minister responsible for defense, started to appear regularly at official military functions, dressed in uniform. The significance of this symbolism was not lost on the public or the troops. We accept the analysis given by Brigadier Retired Granger as accurate, and it harmonizes with the evidence in relation to the effect of paramountcy of the party on the military and paramilitary organizations of the country. We are satisfied that Prime Minister Burnham used this platform in order to exert control over the military and paramilitary organizations of Guyana during that period. We have heard evidence of Senior Superintendent Leslie James, the then head of the Criminal Investigations Department, the CID. He told us that he entered the Guyana Police Force, the GPF, on February the 8th, 1987. Mr. James produced a number of files to the Commission, but significantly and perhaps unsurprisingly, did not produce all the relevant files, though apparently no fault of his own. He produced 3 files, were labeled by the GPF as WPA 8, WPA 9, and WPA 10, meaning Working People's Alliance 8, 9, and 10. These files came from Special Branch, which is a branch of the GPF. Mr. James said that these 3 files cover the period 1980, the very year when Dr. Rodney was killed. Mr. James told the Commission that 2 of these files reflect R.E. death of Dr. Rodney Walters, and the 3rd is a murder file of the accused person, Gregory Smith. This witness was unable to account for the missing files, which Special Branch had at some point in time, namely WPA 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. It is to be noted that Mr. James, on our first day of hearing, did accept that the Walter Rodney files were a matter of continuing interest but could not account for their absence. As discussed elsewhere, of the 3 files relating to 1980, 2 were entitled The Death of Dr. Walter Rodney, and the other was a murder file relating to Gregory Smith. These files were at one point within the custody of the Special Branch. Mr. James could give no account for the disappearance of the files. One possible explanation which we find unacceptable is that there was a serious flood in Guyana in 2005, and many of the files may have been destroyed. That was a matter of some speculation, and there was no hard evidence that the missing files from Special Branch were victims of the flood. There were 2 files missing from the GDF in relation to Gregory Smith, and there was similar speculation that the missing Gregory Smith file might have been the result of the flood. Senior Superintendent Leslie James expressed great surprise at the disappearance of the Special Branch files and said that in his experience that it was first time that he had ever heard of such a thing happening. We fully endorse Mr. James's surprise and adopt it as our own. Concerning the missing GDF file on Gregory Smith, in the context of all of the evidence presented before the Commission, we are satisfied that this was a deliberate act for which the GDF must bear full responsibility. Elsewhere in the report, we have discussed the impact and implications of paramountcy on the civil service and on the state corporations. But as Dan's pointed out in his book, the police force was seriously impacted, as was the civil service bureaucracy. In support of this contention, Mr. Dans referred to an address at pages 132 to 133, delivered by Prime Minister Burnham to middle-level management of the police force at a training course. He said, among other things, "You cannot enforce law and order in vacua. Law and order have to be enforced within a particular context of values and objectives. ... Incidentally, I would prefer to drop the word enforce and its derivative enforcing and use instead assisting fellow citizens to have a greater regard for the law and its norms. ... I say without apology because there are still some who would say that the police force must be apolitical. It must merely enforce the law. Policemen are citizens first and then vocationally policemen. You will be judged by your performance not only professionally but as a citizen, as a man, as a builder of a new society. ... I have hope, nay, a conviction, that out of those series of courses there will come many real leaders in terms of the definition I have attempted to set out. ... Mr. Clement Rohe testified about the impact of paramountcy on the public service and on the military. Referring to Saludin in his book, Guyana, The Struggle for Liberation, 1945 to 1992, wrote on page 308 to 309, where he is quoted as follows. Significant numbers of public servants and the military were expected to pledge allegiance to the PNC. They did under the practice of party paramountcy, a policy that placed the PNC over and above all other organizations and agencies and relegated the Parliament and the government to its position of subservience in relation to the PNC. At page 308 of Saludin's book, the following is recorded. The death of WP activist Walter Rodney on June 13, 1980, widely regarded as a political assassination engineered by sources associated with the Burnham regime as a means of demolishing the rising tide of opposition to Forbes Burnham, should not be regarded as a means of destroying the WPA only. In wider terms, such an act has to be interpreted as conveying a powerful signal to other forces opposed to Burnham, and to such potential forces as may have been contemplating an alliance with the WPA, that Machiavelli had not written The Prince in vain. The involvement of person or persons associated with the military in the death of Walter Rodney is widely suspected.
The tragic and highly unusual circumstances surrounding the deaths of Father Dark and Walter Rodney have to be interpreted in the wider context of excessive political repression, aimed at suppressing the rising tide of discontent even among Burnham's traditional urban supporters. The 1979-80 period was one of intense WPA political activity centered mainly in the capital city, the traditional Burnham stronghold. Burnham could not stand by and allow his political stronghold to be usurped by newcomer Walter Rodney, whose leadership of the WPA resulted in masses of Africans, particularly the disadvantaged and dispossessed, flocking WPA activity. The views of Saludin expressed herein were fully supported by Ayusi Kwayana, Karen D'Souza, and Edward Lawrence Rodney. They all testified that in their judgment it was Burnham who killed Walter. Karen D'Souza also testified that there were policemen in plain clothes who were particularly vicious and used hockey sticks and police batons on members of the public who attended WPA meetings. She went so far as to name a member of the death squad, whose surname was Fanfare. Reverend Rupert Gilbert testified in graphic detail about a large WPA meeting held at Border Green at which the police used tear gas when Rodney was speaking, in an attempt to break up the meeting. Rodney's reaction is worthy of mention. In the words of Reverend Gilbert, he advised the crowd, "Get down! All you get down!" The whole crowd got down flat on the grass until the tear gas subsided. We have already commented on the sharp increase in the military establishment in the period under review. What has not been earlier indicated is that the increased militarization of the state led to an appreciable growth of the spy network. It should be indicated, however, that there was no evidence implicating the Guyana National Service or the Guyana People's Militia in surveillance activities against the political opposition for the period 1st January 1978 to 31st December 1980. That exemption, however, cannot be extended to the Guyana Police Force and the Guyana Defense Force, as these two organizations were obviously and clearly tasked by the Political Directorate to carry out surveillance on the political opposition during the said period. Support for that conclusion was found in the special branch files produced by Senior Superintendent Leslie James. The evidence of Minister Rohi speaks to the surveillance of the PPP's party leader, Dr. Chetty Jagan, and the headquarters of the PPP Freedom House as well. Specifically, Dr. Jagan suffered frequent stops and searches at the airport when departing the country and when returning. Any party literature which he was carrying was seized without reasonable or probable cause. Edward Rodney testified to specific incidents that occurred during the 1978 to 1980 period. In support of his statement that Guyana was under a dictatorship, pointed to the persistent misuse and abuse of the military and paramilitary organizations in the country. He identified the following. The GPF that time was acting as an arm of the ruling party. The police were used to break up strikes against people who were standing in lines and being unruly or waiting to get bread, kerosene, or whatever. The mountain police were used to intimidate. There were some professionals amongst the police force who were not as antagonistic and violent as other police officers. There were the Bauxite Workers' Union and the Guyana Stores Workers' strikes, and the brown-clothes policemen were used to intimidate those striking workers. They were used, together with the House of Israel operatives or members, to break up strikes and intimidate workers. Persons who descended on the striking workers at Guyana stores could be members of the House of Israel or the Young Socialist Movement, YSM, the young arm of the PNC. The attackers would pull away the pickets being carried by the striking workers and attacking them while the police were standing idly by without restraining the attackers. The Commission also received evidence stating that there was also in circulation among police officers a recognition handbook Working People's Alliance on WPA members. Ayusi Kwayana, in his pamphlet titled Walter Rodney, explained at page 38 what was the role and purpose of the recognition handbook. He wrote as follows. About late March 1980, before Walter Rodney was denied the right to travel, though he pledged to return to face his trial, there came into his hand a copy of the Recognition Handbook, Working People's Alliance. A U.S. journalist who was shown it at a press conference said, "Oh, a hit list." The booklet carries the following under the caption forward. These notes are designed to provide a guide to the easy recognition of personnel of the Working People's Alliance and the vehicles that are associated with the organization's activities. It must be appreciated that vehicle numbers and color may change from time to time, as is now a regular practice with that organization. A copy of the Recognition Handbook was presented to the Commission, and in addition to the photographs of high-profile members of the WPA contained therein, there is also biographical data and passport numbers. These would normally be outside of the knowledge and reach of ordinary persons. In the circumstances, we conclude that the handbook was clearly and obviously compiled by the agency of the state which had access to personal and privileged information of those WPA members mentioned in the handbook. That handbook was in regular use among police officers at the time. It is of interest to record that evidence was received that shortly after Mr. Odin Ishmael took up his post as ambassador of Guyana to the US, based in Washington, in June 1993, he came across a large number of documents entitled the Walter Rodney Files in the garage of the embassy. The interpretation which we put on that find is that they were documents sent from Guyana to its embassy in Washington, updating the embassy personnel about events and activities of the PNC administration at home in relation to its harassment and oppression. The techniques were applied by consular and diplomatic personnel abroad as well. This is supported by Mr. Rohi, who testified that Guyanese living in North America and who were members of the PNC often received harassing calls from consular and diplomatic officials. Other prominent members of the Guyanese society also recognized the abuse of power by the PNC administration. Mr. Ashton Chase, SC, founding member of the PPP, lawyer and trade unionist, writing in his book, Guyana, A Nation in Transit, Burnham's Role, reflected his views at page 49. It, the National Security, Miscellaneous Provisions, Act, Chapter 1602, Act Number 7 of 1966B of the Laws of Guyana, enabled his government to detain persons whom they were satisfied were acting or might act in a manner prejudicial to public order, public safety, or the defense of Guyana. The detentions were authorized for 3 months, but could be extended for longer periods after reference to a tribunal, whose personnel were carefully chosen by him. It also enabled the restriction of the movements of suspected persons. Extended powers, as if under an emergency, were given to the police. Entry by police officers from the ranks of inspector upwards without warrant was authorized in pursuance of an aim of the Act to control unauthorized possession or use of explosives, firearms, and ammunition. The weaklings in the opposition camps were easy prey for his network. This particular aspect is supported by the clear and unequivocal evidence of Major General retired Norman McLean. See Day 12, transcript, page 92. Burnham's grip and absolute control over the Guyanese society was so firm and extensive that he dehumanized and belittled many Guyanese by compelling them to clean trenches, canals, or drains, thus giving credence to the slogan, "Trench or be retrenched." Mr. Chase reflects the experience at page 158 of his book. The jobs done were basically unskilled work, such as cleaning trenches, drains, canals, weeding, and underbrushing, picking up coconuts, fetching goods. The crux, however, was that while the various activities were taking place, he would strut around on his horse, stirrup, whip, et al., from one field to another over the estate. In this overseer role, instructions were shouted to the unfortunate to do or do over this or that task. The whip whacked and cracked in terror at some of these unfortunate victims. We next turn to our consideration of Burnham's speech in his capacity as Commander-in-Chief, Prime Minister, and leader of the PNC, in his address at the Third Biennial Congress of the People's National Congress, Volume 2, August 22 to 26, 1979, at the National Exhibition Park. At that time, Rodney and the WPA were attracting increasing numbers of all ethnicities in their public meetings. The Office of the General Secretary of the PNC, located in the Ministry of National Development, had suffered damage as a result of a fire on July 11, 1979. The stature of Rodney on the political scene, already large, was growing rapidly. The WPA, led by Rodney in association with the PPP and with organizations across the country, were seen to be united against Burnham and the PNC administration. That was the context in which Burnham made the below-mentioned remarks at the conference, and I quote, "We are a party of peace, but we are not pacifists, and literally and metaphorically, we promise to match steel with steel and fire with fire. So, comrades, let us deal now with another of them, the worst possible alternative. That is what they must be known by. What does WPA stand for? Comrades, they had met to make their wills, because so far as we are concerned, we are not asking them for quota, and we will not give them any." Burnham concluded his address to the conference after describing the WPA as the worst possible alternative with the following words. "The People's National Congress will never start violence. The People's National Congress did not ask for a confrontation. But comrades, as I said on Thursday, the battle is joined. No holes are barred." His final words were, "Comrades, we are now in the Roman amphitheater. The lion and the gladiator cannot both survive. One must die, and we know that the People's National Congress will live." There has been much debate whether the words used by Mr. Burnham represented rhetorical excess or whether they were serious and threatening words reflecting the extent to which Rodney and the WPA had become a matter of serious concern to him. Many of the witnesses who testified before us were of the view that, given the previous and subsequent events, the words were in fact a serious threat to the WPA and its members, particularly Rodney. Those who so concluded were aware of the fate earlier suffered by Edward Dublin, Ohini Koama, Nazir Khan, and others. The unions, too, that had not fallen in line and were not supportive of the PNC administration did not escape police surveillance and harassment. COI Guyana, in his book Walter Rodney, 1991, the union which appeared to me to practice the highest level of internal democracy was NACI, which, on a decision of the executive, appointed me on my application to work at organizing classes, taking my offer to work at the minimum wage. I left full of respect for its democratic procedures, and only when my presence there attracted all sorts of political surveillance, the photographing of all those entering the building, and a whole squadron of police measures which could not help an independent trade union to keep its integrity. ... Yet, such is the disrespect of the regime for trade unions and other organizations that they felt any presence there had something to do with politicizing the union. That was first published in 1988 by the Working People's Alliance, Guyana, South America. The Young Socialist Movement, YSM, was a youth arm of the PNC. It was involved in violent activities in support of the PNC. At one stage, the YSM was led by Robert Corbyn, and it worked in close cooperation with the House of Israel in carrying out acts of violence and intimidation against WPA members. Indeed, Reverend Gilbert testified that on one occasion he was grabbed, beaten, and rammed in his ribs by the YSM. His experience resulted in 2 broken ribs before he was handed over to the police. He was hospitalized for about a week. He testified to a second incident in which he was forewarned by a neighbor and member of the PNC that he was going to be visited one night by YSM hitmen who were going to kill him, and use as their reason for doing so that he had a gun in his guitar. He slept at the university that night and asked his brother to keep the house. The next morning, when he went home, his brother informed him that members of the YSM had come to the home during the night looking for him. That incident took place about 2 or 3 months before Rodney's death. The YSM's role, as described above, was reinforced by the testimony of Mr. Joseph Hamilton. He testified that there were a lot of coordination between the YSM Cadet Corps and the House of Israel. The House of Israel, he said, had several points of coordination in the relationship with the PNC, and he named Mr. Hamilton Green, Mr. Robert Williams, now deceased, and Mr. Emerson Simon, who worked at the PNC headquarters. Addressing terms of reference 4, we have no hesitation in concluding that, in the face of evidence presented, both the Guyana Police Force and the Young Socialist Movement, and those in command and superintendence of these agencies, were tasked with the surveillance of and the carrying out of actions against the political opposition, specifically the WPA and the PPP. We find as fact that those acts of harassment and surveillance included, but were not limited to, constant surveillance, breaking up of political meetings, harassing, threatening, assaulting, or beating members or supporters of political opposition, killing innocent persons who were associated with the political opposition, arresting, locking up, or charging members or supporters, or carrying out searches of homes and other places without reasonable or probable cause. End of chapter.